Let's look at what the Chinese have been doing since the end of the 1970s. Upon realizing that their system was not producing the results required to be a major power in the world, certainly against the Western powers. All right? What the Chinese have been doing since the 1970s has been modifying their communist system so as to integrate their system with the capitalist world economy. No amount of domestic propaganda could obscure the fact that they were losing economic ground to the capitalist West. You can see this geographically with the new orientation in China since the 1970s, indicated by this image here that shows you new economic growth zones in China, and they're all located along the coast. And what this means is that China has actively launched a set of economic reforms that have promoted these coastal locations. Why these coastal locations? Because it is here where they can communicate with or transact with the world economy they wish to integrate with. And so the Chinese government has released progressively more and more, or given more and more local control, it's a matter of degree, of course, to economic profiteering that has facilitated a migration of industrial production from the interior to the coastline. And these reforms are supposed to convert China from a centralized command economy to a market economy. I didn't say a wholly free market economy. In fact, nobody has that. But that's the ideal. In these red and green special economic zones, Communist China allows foreign direct investment, foreign capital to come in, often with free market mechanisms at work. And the Chinese government has essentially retracted the heavy hand of communist government management. You can see that here by foreign direct investment that's been focused on these cultural states, right? The height of those graphs shows you where FDI has been coming in, all right? And it's overwhelmingly concentrated on these coastal states. It makes sense that the foreigners would want to concentrate growth here, because if you're a corporate power of some sort, you're looking for cheaper labor. China has plenty of cheap labor, massive population, and you actually appreciate the authoritarian government, because the authoritarian government makes sure that that labor is cheap. If it complains about working conditions, you don't have to worry about dealing with that yourself. If you're the corporation, the communist state will do it for you. It is an ironic flipping of roles there. But foreign capital is going to come in here and saying this is a fine opportunity to get access to cheap labor. And you want to get access to that labor directly on the coast so that you can produce whatever you want with that cheap labor and then ship it right back to the home market, be it the United States or England or wherever it is. All right? So you see that the coastal areas have come to be pronounced in terms of where Chinese opportunity is located at. And foreigners and their capital play a sizable role in this process. This has been very successful for the Chinese. They've experienced, really since certainly the late 80s, early 1990s, all right, substantial amount of growth, sometimes getting as high up to roughly averaging about 8% per year. I think they actually reached 10% in 95. The point being, that's a remarkable amount of growth per year, leading many to suggest that the 21st century is going to be the Chinese century. That's a bit simplistic, of course. Nevertheless, you can see how there's going to be a lot of optimism about Chinese opportunity. And I shouldn't just say Chinese opportunity. This is just an opportunity for capital, because capital is going to come in from wherever it's coming from to take advantage of this. So it isn't strictly Chinese, and it's not being done against the outside world. It's being done in conjunction with the elite and rich powers of the outside world. Unfortunately, there are things you don't hear about this growth in China because of the authoritarian nature of the government. Yes, you're getting substantial growth rates, but it's producing a massive divide within China. You can see here, look where at the growth of annual income, and you can see that the pink line is urban. If you're in urban locations, your income is going up dramatically. But if you remain in the rural countryside, look how the gap is growing. And so you're getting getting richer in China, and the poor are losing ground. That's what that gap means. And remember, this is China who recently had a revolution, a peasant-based revolution under Mao, successful in 1949, and in short order, it looks like the peasants have been subjugated to a secondary role, facilitated by a communist government in China, whatever communism is in the sense. It's sort of remarkable. I don't know if you can call China communist anymore. They have a stock market, all right? They have something called unemployment, things that a proper communist state simply does not have. So let's just call it a state that's practicing state capitalism. As I mentioned, when you're seeing urban opportunity growing like this compared to rural incomes over here, this is why you have the world's history's largest migration taking place right now in China. It's this massive population moving from the countryside heading to the cities. The government is trying to slow this down because you get more and more people heading to the cities get congested. The state has to provide more money for infrastructure, for water, for power, for transportation. All these things, unfortunately, the negatives that go with them, the congestion, is going to get in the way of the lucrative industrial production you wish to promote there. So the Chinese government would like to stop this process or slow it down anyway. It's impossible because you can't consider much of this labor to be migrating illegally actually up here. It's of domestic origin, but you have to have permission for that migration. There's something called the Hukuo system. Let's not worry about the fineries there. But the point being is China's growth comes with a dramatic stratification of wealth in China, which will have to be dealt with at some point, lest the country grows unstable. And therefore, you can see the incredible change in China in a short period of time. 1949, you had the Communist Revolution. That communist system is still technically in place, although its communist principles don't seem to be relevant to its capital-based focused right now. But you've gone in a short period of time from China being based in its ancient peasant class to a now new rising urban consumer elite who have a lifestyle very much like the majority of lifestyle of people who are in this class. All right, an urban consumer elite population. And this results in a dramatic change in the propaganda in the state. Here's to the left, the traditional Chinese propaganda prior to this era of consumer-based urban development. And you get down with the chief backer of revisionist line of education, whatever, all this. I love these old posters that advocate some kind of virtuous communist righteousness. And you can see what that would have been. Oh, that's just 1968. A short period of time later, you see the state clearly harmonized in supporting this type of advocacy for whatever that is, consumerizing, consumer values, something that you would recognize in the West quite readily. That's the China that you see today. A China that's increasingly looking for more and more power resources, bring it into conflict with the West, principally the United States and the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, because it's looking for more and more oil resources to service this growth. But it's a strange relationship. Globalization means that this growing economy is now integrated with the American economy, with the French, the German economy. You can't see them as separate units anymore. The Chinese do not want to do any damage to the American economy since so much of its own growth is premised on the American market and American capital. Neither does the United States really want to damage the Chinese economy since the Chinese economy is providing so much manufacturers, mass-consume manufacturers, and cheap labor to the American economy. Plus, you have to ask yourself, what do you mean when you're talking about a U.S. versus China? This is what globalism is essentially saying, that it's the state identity becomes less relevant. It's just those who have wealth within the global system and those who don't that you need to be looking at. Therefore, you end up with a problematic problem of wealth gap growing in China, where there's a bunch of have-nots and a bunch of haves that you can see in the background. That China's disparities are beginning to reflect those that you see in the West, which also has stratification of wealth. But at least when the Western economies have emphasized or shown a pronounced stratification of wealth, they already had established middle classes. China never had that. So at some point, China will have to reinvest a lot of its resources away from rapid growth, all right, that you see now, and reinvest in stabilizing the inequities domestically. Because remember, those inequities were terribly important to generating the Maoist communist revolution of the early 20th century. In any case. Now, there are numerous other aspects of China I could talk about. Especially with respect to oil, with respect to domestic power production, with respect to the ecological disaster zone much of China has turned into. They have been emphasizing growth so dramatically that proper restrictions for the preservation of ecological environments, ecologically healthy environments, has been lacking. And so you've seen environmental damage here on a mammoth scale, and pollution of which can be detected globally in the atmosphere. This is a real issue. China will have to deal with these problems, but right now they are emphasizing growth. And the reason why you're not getting a lot of resistance within China is because it's still an authoritarian governance. You don't have a green movement to the same degree you have here in the United States and Western Europe, because you have democratic liberalism well established here. Not so in China. It's an authoritarian governance. So there are green movements here, but they're not as institutionalized, legitimized, and not as mainstream as that you find here in any case. These are problems for China, a growing power, but one that's unfortunately aggravating a lot of the ecological problems that are now considered fundamentally associated with globalization. In fact, if this growing Chinese population, of this middle class population, which is still a small percentage of whole in China, if it wants to consume, as it can clearly see in its visual media devices, if it wants to consume resources like you do in the United States or in Western Europe, I believe it's been estimated you would need 2 to 3 more planet Earths of resources to satisfy this large population. That's just if they wish to consume at the levels that Westerners do. That obviously isn't going to happen. So China has some issues. Along with its growing economic success, it has some domestic issues having to do with the wealth gap in any case. Now I'm going to leave it there for China for the moment, because I got to move along.